Hello everyone. My name is Elise. Welcome to my channel. We are doing the best video of the year today because it's my best books of the year. So I'm very excited to be able to share all of these books with you. My voice is back to normal, basically, for the most part. So I'm excited to be filming with my normal voice again. It's gonna be magical. So I will say a few of the books on my list are by imprints of HaperCollins, and the HaperCollins strike is still currently going on. So I will link information about that down below so you can read more about it. So please visit the information down below. We will go ahead and get into my top 15 books of the year. I went back and forth on the number that I was gonna do. I could have done a 12, I could have done a 15. I went with 15, partially because the first 6 months of the year I was on BookTube, so there are a lot of books that I haven't chatted about yet, so I wanted to include a little bit more that I hadn't had the chance to speak about. So we're gonna do top 15. They are ranked, so we will be going from my kind of lower end of the top 15 to the top end. All of the books are amazing though. All of them I highly recommend. And I will say this year it was kind of unique that the majority of the books I would say are favorite books of the year. And then my top 3 books are favorite books of all time. So it's sort of a step up in that top 3 that just really were meaningful to me in one way or another. So I will reiterate that when we get there so you remember, but yeah, that's a little bit of what we're going to look forward to in this video. So let's go ahead and get into this because this video is gonna be long. I'm prefacing that now. It's my opportunity to kind of wax lyrical about all these books that I loved. So I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna, talk more in depth about all of the books that I liked and why. I won't give spoilers, but I am going to talk a little bit more in detail than I normally would. All right, so my number 15 is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. This is a little bit of a spoiler for my December wrap-up because I read this one in December. It's the only book I read in December that ended up making it on the list. So this is published by Black Cat. And this was just as good as everyone says that it is. It is a collection of in some ways it feels like a collection of short stories, interconnected short stories. But this follows a wide range of women, so many women. And each section is broken up into 3 different subsections. And each one of the subsections is about a woman. And every section that comes after follows a woman that took place as a side character in the story before it. So they're all connected in some way. They're all Black British women, and it just shows all the intersectionality of Black British women, and it does a really good job of that. So I will say, of course, some women's stories I found more intriguing than others. But all of them were great. The writing was spectacular, and I get why so many people love this. It was so fun to get to follow all of these different storylines and get a real deep dive into a certain snapshot of their life. Follows wide ranges, sexualities, all these types of things, careers. So it was really interesting, and I very much enjoyed Girl, Woman, Other. I get why it won the Booker Prize, even though it tied, but it still won. So that is Girl, Woman, Other. My number 14 pick is a book that I haven't spoken about yet because I read it very early in the year, and that is The Wolf Den. This is by Elodie, Harper, and it's published by Head of Zeus. And this is a historical fiction, which I don't read a lot of, but spoiler alert, there is another one on this list. So this follows a woman who is kind of thrust into the sex slave trade in Pompeii. This is pre-eruption in Pompeii, and her name is Amara, and Amara is the main character, but we follow all of the other women who work in that brothel, and I say like work, are forced to work into that brothel, and it's called the Wolf Den, so that's why it's titled this way. And I really appreciated that we got to follow each woman. While Amara is our character, we get a lot of backstory about all of the other women there, and it shows all of the paths that women had into being sold into this slave trade. And like each of them, like some of them came from like somewhat middle class, like high society lives, and because they're women in this world and don't have a lot of power, there's so many things that could happen to them that could put them in destitution and like open up the opportunity for people to take advantage of them. So it was really unique to find that like some people were born into the brothel, some people were not, and to get to experience the horrors and like the vast horrors that could lead someone to be in this predicament. Another thing I very much enjoyed is that Amara is a main character that you can really root for. She's highly intelligent and she is determined to get herself out of this situation and believes that she can find a way to get herself out of it. So throughout the whole novel, she's coming up with kind of like schemes to try and get out of it, try and find like glimmers of hope and happiness, and also in some ways like take care of the people, the women around her if she's able to. So a lot of interesting relationship dynamics going on in this, mostly platonic, but yeah, just very interesting, and a great main character and cast of characters to watch. This is a part of a series and I very much plan on continuing, so I'm gonna pick up the next one sometime in 2023 because it is already out. It's called The House with the Golden Door. But yeah, love the Wolf Den, and I adore this cover, this like stunning orange and gold cover with all of the women in the archways. So yeah, love this, highly recommend. My number 13 is the other historical fiction on here, and you might have heard me talk about this before, so this might not be a surprise, but that is just Great Circle, not the, I know everyone does that. So Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, and this is published by Knopf. This is the proof copy. I think there's an actual photo, a black and white photo of what the copy looks like in here. So this was on the Women's Prize this year. It got a lot of buzz, and it's very deservedly so. Again, I don't read a lot of historical fiction, and this is over 600 pages, but I just adored this. There was not a dull moment in this. The pacing was done so well, and this follows two women, but one storyline is bigger than the other. So the main storyline follows Miriam, and this takes place in the past. This is the historical fiction part of it, and it takes place in the early 1900s in Montana, I believe. Yeah, in like Prohibition era Montana. It follows Miriam, and she wants to be a pilot. More than anything else, she wants to be a pilot, and she is determined to make that happen for herself, similar to the last book that I was talking about. And that is like kind of her arc of the story. And then she also has a brother who is very much a part of the story as well. He's an artist, and is very sensitive, and that's juxtaposed to Miriam's very much like kind of cold determination in some regard. And then they also have an uncle who is kind of a drunkard, also an artist who is struggling with gambling and alcoholism and can't get his life on track. We get lots of information from all of them, and they're so interesting to follow. There is some bisexual rep in this, which is great and I think done very well. And then we have a different storyline in present day that follows an actress who is going to be playing Miriam in like a biopic. So those storylines are much shorter and meant to be secondary in my opinion. And I think those storylines do such a good job of reflecting back what we're looking at in the historical part when we follow Miriam. So these are much more thinky. There's a lot more inner monologue that the actress is having, and it perfectly encapsulates some of the ideas and themes that you got to see in the sections before. So I loved that about it. Those sections had a lot of like quotes that I really resonated with. A lot of stuff about like loneliness and isolation and shame and how that's all wrapped into womanhood. How women struggle in their careers in much different ways than men do, and they have to work much harder in a lot of aspects in order to do well, and they're judged a lot more. So I thought they did a good job of mirroring each other in certain ways, but then also like adding that kind of reflective voice that I think Maggie Shipstead inserted so well. So I thought this was great. Again, flew through this for how long it was. The pacing really is truly spectacular. I don't get how she kept me intrigued for this long with no low points. So highly recommend Great Circle if that sounds interesting to you. All right, the next one is a 5-star book, but it's a part of a series, and maybe people knew that this was coming, but this is A Dangerous Collaboration by Deanna Raybourn, and this is in the Veronica Speedwell series. This is the 4th book in the series. And for people who've read this series, I think this is commonly one of the favorites, if not the favorite of the series, and there's an obvious reason for that, and there's a less obvious reason for that, at least for me. So this one follows Veronica and Stoker, as they all do, but it also incorporates Stoker's brother, who has a very tumultuous relationship with him, and he becomes just as important of a character in this one, and they're investigating, obviously, a murder. This one I think is the most atmospheric of all of them, and it takes place on an island, and it's very isolated, it's very gothic, much more than the other ones, and I just loved it. I adored it for so many reasons, but that's all I'll say specifically about that one, and that's not giving away any of the macro plot by any means. So the series as a whole, as I've said many times in the past, follows Veronica and Stoker. So in the first one, Veronica, who is a lepidopterist or a butterfly scientist that studies butterflies, she finds herself in danger. So somebody's trying to kill her, and this older man kind of mysteriously pops up and saves her in a certain situation and says like, hey, I just need you to trust me. I know you don't know who I am, but I have your best interest at heart. Come with me, let me help protect you. And she does. And he says that he's gonna go off to do some investigating and leaves her in the care of his friend Stoker. And Stoker was previously a part of high society. This all takes place in 1800s Victorian London. And he had a fall from grace in high society and is now pretty much destitute. He's a taxidermist, and that's how he's surviving. He previously was a surgeon, and he is in charge of keeping Veronica safe. Veronica, being the smart and kind of mischievous woman that she is, decides that she is going to investigate as well because she needs answers. And Stoker has no choice but to go with her so he can make sure that nothing happens to her. So that's how the adventure starts. Each one is a murder mystery. They're so fantastic. Very Sherlock Holmes-esque if you're into that. And I just adore this series. I read the first 5 this year and have so much enjoyed my time with them. It's probably the reading experience that I just had the most fun with, that I was just racing to get through them, and I haven't felt that in a long time, so it was such a joy to have that experience, and I very much recommend them. Okay, so my number 11 is another one that I don't have. It is a new release, and I typically read new releases from the library, and that is how I did this one, and that is We Had to Remove This Post. This is by Hanna Bervoets, and thank you for the person who corrected me on how to pronounce that name. I had looked it up multiple times and was still pronouncing it wrong, so thank you. This one is translated from the Danish by Emma Rault, and it's published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is a really unique publisher, but that I don't want to go on that side tangent. So this follows a woman who has just started a new job as a content moderator. And something that I really enjoyed about this book is while she is, again, the main character, there are other side characters that start at the same time as her, and they start with this kind of like framing setup of being in training. And I thought that was such a brilliant way to start this novel, because it allows us to see the impacts of being a content moderator day in and day out in multiple different perspectives, and it affects them all differently. And I think that was such a unique take on this, is to like get to see all of these different experiences. And our main character is increasingly struggling, let's say, to deal with the effects of seeing mostly violent content on a day-to-day basis. We're watching them all as they're just inundated with this, and they start to play this game with each other where they make up scenarios and decide if they would remove that content or not. And that's weaved throughout the book. And I also really enjoyed that aspect of it, of like what happens when your lens of viewing the world is so taken over by this idea of whether or not it should be able to be up on the internet, and the nuance that is involved in that, but also the corruption that's involved in that too, and the exploitation that comes with it. So for example, if something is newsworthy, right, then even if it doesn't meet the other guidelines, they'll keep it up. But if something is not newsworthy, then they'll take it down. And like, how does that affect public consciousness? It just has so many interesting things to say about this. This book, plot-wise, does go off the rails. So if you're not a person that likes that, this might not be for you, but it does go off the rails, and I think that was really fun and smart. I think that this also questions, like, how do you know if you're the bad guy or the good guy? And that's just a fun and interesting, like, kind of river to navigate. So there were so many things I think that you can love about this. I don't think it's a perfect novel 100%, but I just think the things that it was trying to do are so smart, so innovative, and like I saw a lot of thought and care there. So I very much enjoyed this and would highly, highly recommend it. My number 10, which also has a plot that goes off the rails, is Vladimir, and that is by Julia May Jonas. This is published by Avid Reader Press, and this one follows middle-aged woman. I think she's like maybe like 50s or 60s, and she is a professor at a liberal arts college, and she is married to another professor at the liberal arts college, and her husband becomes embroiled in a Me Too like scandal. He has been sleeping with his students, and they are in an open relationship, and she was aware that he was sleeping with students. It follows them as this information comes out, and from her perspective, how she feels about this. That's one plot going on. The other plot going on is that a new teacher comes to town, Vladimir, and our main character becomes increasingly obsessed with him. He is an up-and-coming writer and professor, and she, just is enamored with him in multiple ways, for his career, for his looks, for his youth, all these types of things that she is longing for. And I think this story, while again, I don't think perfect, does so many things really interestingly. First of all, this shows a wide array of opinions and responses to the scandal. You get kind of the main character's student's perspective, which is very much like a younger perspective of today, what most of us would probably agree with, where like in that type of power dynamic, you can't have consent. So it's having that conversation. Then it has our main character's perspective, which in some ways encapsulates some of the older generation's opinion on this matter, which is like, if you agreed to it and wanted to do it, then that's consensual, and the power dynamic doesn't matter. So I think it did a good job of juxtaposing those views, because those are two views that happen, right? Like, one is obviously flawed and not right, but it's real. That's reality. So I think it did a good job of having some commentary on that. I think this did a really interesting take on kind of like youth and beauty culture, and the negative effects that that can have on people, especially women, but it also happens for the men as well. And I appreciated that perspective. So yeah, like how do you navigate getting older in a world that doesn't value people who are older? How do you navigate kind of losing your conventional beauty in a world that doesn't value people who aren't conventionally beautiful as much? Like, all those things were very interesting. And the other thing that I liked is I think this had a really good conversation on exploitation. So for me, I think the title is not for nothing. And I do think that this is trying to reference Lolita in some ways. And the character of Vladimir in here is very much exploiting his wife. His wife has been through some trauma and she is writing a memoir, and it's really good. And he is exploiting that trauma in order to get a job and a raise and a promotion at work. These men who exploit women's plights in order to get what they want, and like how nefarious and common that really is. For all those reasons, I just adored this. I thought it had a lot of interesting things to say that are very relevant to our current time. And again, the plot goes off the fucking rails. So this felt very much like a drama, like so dramatic, really rompy. I liked that it went off the rails at the end. I thought that was like such a climactic moment to watch. But I do know that some people won't like that. So just have that caveat going in. But that is Vladimir. All right, next book that we have here is my number 9. And this is a very slight book, and that is Thirst. And this is by Amelie Nothomb. And this is translated from the French by Alison Anderson and published by Europa. It's very short, as I said. And this is a religious satire, so it follows Jesus the 48 hours up until his crucifixion. So it starts with him at his trial, and then it follows him through the crucifixion. This does a lot of things really well, and this was by far one of the funniest books I read all year. It is so freaking funny. I just like, it's so good. And books rarely make me laugh, so this actually had me laughing out loud. In the beginning, there's stuff where like a man at the trial, people are testifying, and he's like, well, yeah, you gave me my eyesight back, but now I have to look at like how ugly my house is, or like something like that. And they're all going through these things of like, yeah, you performed these miracles for me, but like now I'm being all whiny and complaining about something that doesn't really matter. And then it also has these really poignant moments of Jesus reflecting on what it means to be human and humanity in general. So it'll go from really funny to really reverent and back and forth, and I think it transitions through that so well. There were so many parts of this where I was like, man, that is a really interesting philosophical take on what it means to be human. It just like, it got me. It did all of that in a very short amount of pages. And I just think this is exactly what a novella should be. It was like trying to be funny and poignant, and it did that. And it did it in a really succinct way that still made sense in the plot. So this was just fantastic. I highly recommend it if you're into religious satire. If you're not into that, it might not work for you. I'm going to say that now. But if you are open to that, I think that this could definitely be a hit. And I haven't seen enough people reading this, so highly recommend Thirst. All right, coming in at number 8 is Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. This is published by Scribner. This was on the Booker long list, so there was a decent amount of people reading it this year, and it was stunning. This is a debut novel, and it follows a family, so we get multiple POVs. One of them, and arguably the main one, follows a woman who has cancer. She was in remission previously, and now her cancer has returned, and it's how she's coping with that discovery and realizing that this time it is most likely going to be terminal. So she is doing a lot of reflecting on her past and what got her to this moment, And those parts were so like touching and hard and heavy, but done really well. It didn't seem heavy-handed in any way. We also get perspectives from her husband and her daughter, and those perspectives were like also just heart-wrenching, but I think really rounded out this experience of, yeah, what do you do when you know someone you love is going to die, and how do you cope with that grief, kind of the anticipatory grief of that. And then the really like interesting experimental part of this is that you also get the perspective of cancer itself living inside of her body. And those areas are very experimental. Let me see if I can find some of those. So they look very different on the page. And those were like so jarring to go to in certain ways, but also very lyrical. And it was like very matter of fact of like, here is this like living entity inside the body that just wants to survive. And it talks about things in a very matter of fact way of like, oh, I know she's trying to kill me, but like I've lived another day and stuff like that. Like very, very interesting take. And I highly recommend having the physical version so you can see all of that. It's interesting the way that it's laid out on the page. But I also listened to this as I was reading it physically, and I think that is like chef's kiss, the winning combo, because the way that the audiobook narrator read those passages were so like fascinating to me. The choices that they made, the order in which they said the words, the kind of intonation and the volume in which they read them changed. It was just a fascinating read overall, and such a unique take on someone having a terminal illness. And I just loved it. I adored it. I think it's so good. I can't wait to see what Maddie Mortimer comes out with next. And yeah, definitely pick this up if you are ready for some hard-hitting fiction. All right, number 7 is one that I feel like was very popular last year, maybe even the year before, but I hadn't gotten to it yet. And that is Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. This is published by One World. And this was as good as everyone says too. So this was one of my most anticipated releases the year it came out. So this follows a few people. So we have Reese, who is a transgender woman, and they were in a relationship with, at the time, Amy, now Ames, and they, more than anything else, want to have a baby, Reese does, but is really struggling to make that a reality for herself. So then we go to Ames, who has detransitioned. So they are now man again, and I think the conversation around why someone might detransition was done really well and really beautifully. Ames has a relationship with his boss, Katrina, and that relationship, which is pretty casual, ends up in Katrina being pregnant. Katrina has a desire to, be in a more serious relationship with Ames and try and make it work. Ames then decides that he wants to reach out to Reese and say like, hey, this is the situation. Would you be interested in raising this baby? And he does that for a couple of reasons. One, because Reese has always wanted a child. Ames also feels like because they had to detransition, chose to, there's a lot going on there. But because they detransitioned, they feel very removed from kind of this like queer life in general that they had before, and very removed from that experience. And they think that if Reese can be a part of this experience as, another parent, that Ames might actually be able to see themselves as, a father or a parent as well. That's kind of the plot setup. I think what this book does really well, other than just like having some good representation going on, and Torrey Peters is transgender themselves, so this just shows the idea of like queering something up so well. And by that, I just mean by like refusing binaries, right? So like the more like theoretical definition of queer. There's so many binary breaking things in here that I think are really helpful for us as a society to reflect upon. And I just adored it for this. There is a lot of plot stuff happening in here. So like it is a wild ride, and that's enjoyable. But all of this stuff about like why society has placed all of these labels and binaries on us is where I think the book really shines. So this was so fantastic. Highly recommend it. Think this should just be widely read for those themes and topics alone. So that is Detransition Baby. Number 6 is the first nonfiction to show up on this list, I believe, and that is In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. This is a memoir. Again, this probably needs no introduction. I read this as one of my backlist 5-star predictions, and boy, was it ever a 5-star. This is published by Grey Wolf Press and follows Carmen, who is in an abusive relationship with another woman. And it follows the progression of that relationship. All of that is done not in a linear timeline, but you get interspersed kind of back and forth timelines throughout. And the thing that a lot of people talk about this is that the form is just so experimental. So they're like little vignettes almost, and it'll say like Dream House as Dirty Laundry, or Dream House as Deja Vu, Dream House as American Gothic. And then we'll use that lens to insert a part about what that experience is like. And each one kind of holds a memory within it. So that was just brilliant, to have all this additional meaning from other things kind of incorporated into this memory that she's sharing with us. I loved it. It's so good. I think it was a really just like real on the page description of what it's like to be in an abusive relationship, mainly psychologically abusive, which is not cared about enough in our society and not understood enough in our society. And I know that, you know, Carmen Machado also really wanted to have some representation of that in a queer relationship, because we also don't have representation of that much. So it just is doing so many amazing things. Plus it's incredibly well written. So you can't go wrong with this. As long as you're in the right headspace for it, I definitely think you should pick this up. So that is In the Dream House. All right, number 4 was another new release that I read from the library, and that is Woman Eating by Claire Khoda. And this is published by Harper Via. So this was also widely read this year. It is a, you know, modern vampire story, and I think all it means by modern is just like it's low plot, it's really thinky, and I think it does such a good job of that. So this is basically like one big extended metaphor for disordered eating, and it did it so well. It did it so well. So this follows a woman who is half vampire, half Japanese, is living without her mother, who is the vampire half, for the first time in her life. And she is very much struggling to find blood and is slowly dying, essentially, because she can't find blood. She is an artist, so there is some commentary on art, gatekeepers of the art community, and the unfairness and like nepotism and racism and sexism and all the other isms that go along with that world. And it's also just about her struggling with feeling like the vampire part of herself is demon or wrong or evil, and that she inherently doesn't deserve food. It's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. It's very slow. It's just very like atmospheric and lyrical, and has really beautifully rich descriptions of her just like walking down the street, her lying on the floor of her apartment. It's just wonderfully descriptive in that way. And I think is a really good take on what it's like to struggle with an eating disorder, and kind of the constant worrying of your mind over food and your body and, you know, all these things that go along with that. So I thought it was wonderful. I loved it. I'm glad so many people are reading it, and I want to pick up my own copy soon. So that is Women Eating by Claire Khoda. The next one is another buzzy 2020 release, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea. This was also so good, and I know so many people are loving it, and deservedly so. I think it's fantastic. This is published by Picador, and it's by Julia Armfield. So this one follows two women. One is a marine biologist and goes on deep sea missions, and she is embarking on another deep sea mission, and then it follows her wife, who is waiting for her to come back. So originally she goes on this mission that is supposed to be like 6 weeks, I think, and turns into 6 months, and nobody knows what has happened to them. We flash back and forth between being in the submarine and then being back home with her wife. For me, this book is all about trauma and the physical and relational effects that trauma has on you. And I think something really unique about this book is that so many people, when reviewing this book, have gotten different things out of it. And sometimes I've watched other people review this book and I'm like, what book did you read? Like, that is not the book I read. And I think that's the mark of a book that is doing a lot of things really well. So again, for me, this book is all about trauma. And how that manifests in your body, how that affects your relationships. And I just think it was a brilliant job of doing that. We have flashbacks when Leah is on the submarine, and there's kind of like some mystery surrounding that. And that's kind of like the horror element in this book. And then we follow her wife, Miri, at home waiting for her, and then once she returns, Leah is very different. So it's about them trying to navigate their relationship with one another, and there are strange things happening that I don't want to give away. I don't want to give spoilers away, but yeah, I think this shows what an experience is like when someone goes through trauma, and not only will that change your physical body, but also sometimes that just fundamentally changes who you are as a person, and what happens when the changes that you've experienced mean that you're not as compatible with your partner anymore. Like, how do you navigate that difficulty and change and all the grief that is wrapped up in that? I just loved it. I thought it was such a good take on trauma, and I loved it for that. So highly recommend this one if you're interested. It's very short, so you can read it very quickly. And stunning cover. I like the UK cover, which is the one that I'm showing. And I definitely want to get a copy of that as well. We're in our top 3, baby. So these are the books where I would put in a different tier as being favorite books of all time. If like the other ones are favorite books of the year, these 3 are favorite books of all time. And I really struggled with the order of these 3, but I feel confident as of today that this is the order I can feel good about, but you know, I struggled with it. So just keep that in mind. So number 3 is Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. This is published by Harper, and this was shortlisted for the Women's Prize. A lot of people were reading it. It's so good. So this follows Martha, who at the beginning of the novel is in a crumbling marriage. And then we flash backwards and get the majority of her life. And a lot of it is centered around her undiagnosed mental illness. And it's also undisclosed what that mental illness is. And about the pain and the struggle of navigating not knowing what's going on with you, and then also the collateral damage that has in your life and on the people who love you and the people who are around you most often. So I think this does a lot of things very well. Firstly, I think that the importance of it not being a specific mental illness is paramount. I think it allows a lot of people to see themselves in this. It doesn't put stigma on a certain mental illness in particular, and it is meant to be read as sort of general and with that in mind. So I appreciated it for that, which I know a lot of people did. I think this also shows, again, the difficulty of not having a diagnosis, and then even some, you know, the understanding and sometimes relief, and then also its own grief and pain of when you do get a diagnosis, and what that can mean for your life. I think this does complicated parent relationships really well. Her parents are very different and react very differently to her behavior and her diagnosis. She has a father who just adores her and is able to handle it really well and supportively, and then a mother who is just absent, judgmental, very not communicative, very cold, and, you know, the difficulty of that experience. Another thing that it does well is talk about what it's like to be in a romantic relationship with someone that has a mental illness, and the ways in which that person can be really hurtful and harmful to you, and how that is not okay, right? Mental illness is not an excuse to be an asshole to people, and you have to have accountability for yourself. I think another thing that I loved about her family is this book explores what it's like and has representation of having a platonic soulmate, which I think we need more of, and for her that is represented in her sister. And I think that representation was just lovely, to have a person who will challenge you and also love you unconditionally, and how healing that is for a person. So many good things that this novel does. It uses all of the people around her in really wonderful ways to get some meaningful points across. This book, I do think, is kind of like a novel in two halves, kind of like Sorrow and Bliss. The first half of this novel, I really was so frustrated with Martha. I was like, oh my God, having eye rolls, all of that stuff. And then there's a shift in the middle of the book that's significant, and it just kind of like opens up, like really opens up. And it is much more of a not blissful feeling in the end, but there is some hope and optimism, whereas like the first half is just like anger and sorrow and pain. So I thought that was done very well in Sorrow and Bliss. So please read this book. It's so fantastic. Highly recommend it. That's my number 3. All right, number 2 is Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro. This is translated from the Spanish by Frances Riddle and published by Charco Press. People probably knew this was going to be up there for me if you watch my best books of the year at the midpoint. Oh God, this is just, I said it then and I'll say it now. This is an objectively good novel. I don't care if it's not to your personal taste. It is just well written. I don't think that can be argued that this is just incredibly well written. This follows Elena, whose daughter has seemingly committed suicide at the beginning of the novel. The police have deemed it as a suicide, but Elena feels that she knows that her daughter would not do that, particularly around the way that she committed suicide. Elena decides that she needs help to try and investigate. And the reason that she needs help is because she has Parkinson's. And the representation of Parkinson's I thought was done so well in this novel. So the novel is framed in sections by the medication that Elena is having to take in order to get her body to move. And it is like painstakingly slow for her to move, and it makes you sit in those moments. So it follows her on a 24-hour journey to try and find this woman she believes can help investigate. And the whole book is her trying to get there. So it forces you to sit in how difficult it is for Elena. And I thought that was so smartly done. I think that Elena is not like a extremely likable character, right? So this is playing against this idea that people with disabilities or chronic illness have to be inspirational or like the best human beings ever. Like that's not the case with Elena. She is very angry. Can be cruel, and very like harsh. So that's a part of her experience, and you witness that throughout the novel. I think that this also is an abortion novel, so it follows abortion rights and non-rights in Argentina, where this takes place, and I think has a really nuanced description of abortion in here. I think that this also follows what it means to be a caretaker and how hard that truly is. We don't get enough representation from caretakers either. So it's just doing so many things so well. I loved it. I loved it so much. This will stick with me for a very long time and would widely recommend this. If you're in a place where you can read it, because there are trigger warnings, but widely recommend this. I think it's so impactful and does a really wonderful job of covering difficult topics, and a lot of them in 150 pages. So that is Elena Knows. And my number one book of the year, if you know it, guess down below. It might be obvious, but that is Hola, Papi. This is by John Paul Brammer, and this is published by Simon & Schuster. Now, this book, part of why it is my number one, it is brilliantly written. And this also just met me in a place that I needed it to meet me, and had a lot of personal impact and meaning for me. So I want to be forthright about that. This just, yeah, it touched me personally in so many ways. So this is a memoir about John Paul Brammer's life. He is a writer. He wrote a column called Hola, Papi, and it was an advice column for queer people around, queer issues. So whether that was dating, how to come out to your parents, etc., etc. It follows his entire life, and he is biracial, and that's a little bit of why it's personal to me. I am also biracial, and he has, in some ways, a similar experience, and in other ways, not a similar experience. So it follows him as a kid growing up, struggling with being biracial and what that means. As a kid growing up, struggling with his sexuality. He's gay. So it follows that journey for him. It has so many moments of like laughter and joy, and I laughed out loud. I listened to this on audio, and while I was walking my dog, I would be like straight up cackling out loud on the sidewalk, and people would stare at me because I was just laughing out loud to like seemingly nothing. And again, so rare for me to laugh out loud for a book, and this made me do it multiple times. I also cried during this book. So it was like, took me on a roller coaster of emotions. And I think in order to do that, you have to be a great writer. This does talk about his writing career. So if you're interested in writing, what it means to be a writer, all those types of things, this might be for you. That was very fascinating as well. And yeah, it touched me in so many ways. I think he does a really good job of presenting his story to the reader in a very relatable and accessible way, but just like hits all these notes of again, what it means to be a human being in the world, and how to see value in yourself no matter who you are. And I just loved it. I loved it. It meant so much to me. I highly recommend reading this. Please pick it up. So that is my number one, Hola, Papi. All right. We made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching this. I know it's super long, so if you made it to the end, kudos to you. And thank you for, being interested in the books that I just loved and adored this year. Please let me know what your favorite book of the year was. I will read those. I will read them. Yeah, and let me know what you thought of any of these books here as well. Can't wait for a new year of reading, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.